Daf. This is probably a top 3 daf in the Seches Gittin, because the topic is a very, very deep, powerful subject we're going to learn tonight. It's mentioned a few times in Shas, and here is one of them. Okay, so we're going to start on 60a, Daf Samach Amud Aleph, about 15 or so lines from the top. The first word of the line is Rabba v'Rab Yosef. Okay, let's see what we have in store. Says the Gemara, Rabba v'Rab Yosef the Amri Tarvayu. Rabba and Rab Yosef both say, Hi Sefer Aftarta, Asur Likro Be B'Shabbos. Okay, the reason why this is here, that's the first thing we have to explain, is because we had a Mishnah that on Nuntes, I believe, that spoke about the order of Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, who gets precedence. So the Gemara digressed a little bit into the laws of Sefer Torah, and who gets Aliyos. Then we talked about a Sefer Torah that was missing. Now we're going to talk about whether or not you're allowed to write sections of the Torah by itself, meaning our Torahs today, we have a complete from Bereshis to Zos HaBracha. Back then, it may have been common to write an actual scroll of just Bereshis, right? Like today, what we give our children at a Chumash play, we give them, right, or her just one book, right? If they're learning Bereshis, the first few years, they'll get one Bereshis. So then they didn't have a book like that. They would actually write a whole Sefer Torah with just from Parshas Bereshis to Parshas Vayechi. And that was the end of it. So the Gemara over here is discussing that. And the Gemara mentions that if you wanted to write a Sefer Torah or a scroll with the Haftorah, meaning have 50 or 55, whatever, how many Haftorahs there are, right? 50 somewhat Haftorah books available to read every Shabbos, that's Asur. Gemara says why? Gemara says, my time at Delo Nitan li Kasev, because you can't, like we said, parse out one book, right, by itself. If you want to write a whole scroll of Yirmiyahu, of Yecheskel, of Yeshaya, of Malachim, of Shoftim, that's fine. But if you wanted to take one perek from Sefer Shoftim, okay, and use that, like Parshas Naso, for example, has a Haftorah of the story with Shimshon. So you wanted to write only one perek of Sefer Shoftim, you aren't allowed to do that because you can't take out pieces. It has to be all uniformly together. Gemara says, Mar Baravashi Asur l'taltule nami Asur. Mar Baravashi says you can't even touch it on Shabbos because it's muktzah, right? If you can't lane from it, then it's forbidden. My time of the lochazi because you can't read it. The Gemara says, Velohi, it's not true. Sharlu taltule v'sharlu mikrebe. The truth is you are allowed to. We're going to change our mind now. Everything we said is not true. Why? To Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish ma'ayne b'sifrei degarata b'shabta. Because Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would learn agarata on Shabbos. Okay, the Rav Yaakov Emden explains that during the week it was easier to learn real difficult halachas. Shabbos they would take it easy; they would take a break. So instead of reading novels and People magazine, they would read something more easy on the head, and that was a Sefer Agadata. They would read stories as opposed to, delving into halachic topics like we try to do. So they wanted to take it easy on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, but how could they do that? But how could they do that? After all, you're not allowed to write down Agadata. You can't have a book that has Agadata in it, stories, right? But the answer is, now, why can't you? Because we're going to see on Amud Beis in a minute that there's a special limit that things that are written, that are mentioned, Baal Peh, cannot be written down. But the answer is, Kivan Dolo Efshar, since it's impossible, we break the rule. We're going to take the pasuk in Tehillim of that there's a time and a place for everything. And if it's deemed that we're in peril of losing something forever, then we could make a one-time heter and approve something, even though it's technically not allowed. Hachinami here too by the Sefer. Hachinami here too by the Navi. Even the lo efshar et es lasos Hashem Torasecha. We're going to say that because not every shul has an opportunity to have their own unique scroll of Nevi'im, right? It's impossible. So therefore, would you rather end the practice of saying haftorahs, or would you rather break the rule and write a haftorah down on a scroll? So they got together and said, you know what? It's not so bad, right? The consequence is much worse, right? The consequence of losing this minhag of saying the haftorah just because we don't have a complete Sefer Navi, right? We might as well write it down. It's not the end of the world. That is what the Gemara here concludes regarding this topic. This Gemara, before we get to Amud Beis, happens to come up in Maseches Tamura. Maseches Tamura is dealing with a specific case where a rabbi, where an Amora named Rav Dimi, wanted to send a letter with a halachic psak in it. So we're not going to get into the topic of what exactly there were the halacha was. It was about a certain korban. It was about nesachim. The Gemara says, I'm in Tamura Daf Yud Dalet Amud Beis 14b. If you happen to have a Tamura in front of you, and the Gemara on top says, I'm sorry. Let me just right. So the end of that Gemara basically says, we're going to get to the beginning soon, but we're going to start from the end. That Gemara over there says, just like over here, Es Lasos Hashem. And the Gemara ends off by saying, Amri mutav ti'aker Torah val tishtakach Torah mi Yisrael. That's what I said before, meaning they said, it's better that we break this rule of not writing down Torah Shabbal Peh, right? Better to break that rule than creating this situation where everything's going to be obsolete. We're going to completely forget about it, right? So therefore, we're going to say we could write down, right? We could write down the halacha, we could write down Navi, we could write things that technically we're not allowed to. Okay. So that's the way the Gemara in Tamura ends. The beginning of the Gemara is talking about sending a letter, right? What's wrong with sending a letter that has Torah in it? Again, before they said Es Lasos Hashem, they compared writing a halacha down. I'm reading the Gemara. Amar Abba Breder of Chia Bar Abba Rav Yochanan Kosvei Halachos Kisorev HaTorah. People who wrote down halachas are considered like those who burnt the Torah. V'halamed mehen einon otel schar. And if you learn from those halachas that you wrote down in a book, you don't receive the schar. You don't receive the reward of learning Torah. That's how that Gemara actually starts. Now, knowing that that was actually a Maisa that happened with a certain Amor when he wrote a letter, so now we're going to see the end of the Gemara on Daf Samach in Gittin. I'm sorry, Daf Samach Amud Beis. If you turn to Darish Rabbi Yehuda, Darish Rabbi Yehuda Bar Nachmani. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're about 11 lines from the top on Gittin Daf Samach Amud Beis 60. Darish Rabbi Yehuda Bar Nachmani Meturgam Rav Shimon ben Lakish. The pasuk at the end of Parshas Kitisa, right? Remember, Kitisa is where we get the luchos, shnios. Okay, we have three parshios that discuss Matan Torah. The first one is Yisro, the second one is Mishpatim, and the third one is Kitisa. Okay, big discussion what the order is. A very, very involved discussion. Rashi, Ramban, which one came first, which one came second. Right, there's a whole discussion, but we're going to leave that aside. We're going to talk about a single solitary pasuk at the end of Kitisa that says, basically, after Moshe got the Luchos, Moshe says, Ksov l'chayas hadarim ha'ela. Then it says, Ki al pi hadarim ha'ela. Because of these things, the bris, the Gemara doesn't discuss the end of the pasuk, but this covenant was created because of these things. So the Gemara says, HaKetzad, meaning it sounds, right? It sounds like a little bit of a contradiction. It says Ki al pi, then it says Ksov l'cha. So are you writing it or is it oral? Which one is it? So we say, HaKetzad, dvarim shebechsav iyatarasha le'omran al peh, right? Items that are written down cannot be said over by heart, meaning if you're learning, technically, letter of the law, if you're learning Chumash, right? 5 books of Moses, you can't learn it by heart, okay? There's actually a discussion, we're not going to get to it, about singing, right? Are you allowed to sing a song, right, from the Chumash if you're not looking in? There's a discussion about whether you could say, if you're davening by heart, and you say Az Yashir or Vayosha, right? Things from the davening that we know by heart, right? Can you actually say that by heart? So that's also a problem. Okay, that's not for now. But the second clause is Dvarim Shabal Peh, and on the flip side, Dvarim Shabal Peh, Torah Shabal Peh, i.e., anything that's not written down in the Chumash, that's how we'll define it for now. Iyatai Rashai La'omran B'chsav. You cannot write that down. So Torah that's written, you can't say by heart, and Torah that is said by heart cannot be written down. The Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tana Ela Takosav V'Yatakosav Halachos. Tana Rabbi Shmuel learned from the word Ela. This the pasuk says Ela. This is what you write, but you cannot write down halachos, which is Torah Shabal Peh. Okay, so that is basically the way the Gemara ends. So now we understand why on Amud Aleph it was okay to make an exception to write Navi by itself, because Navi is not the Chamishe Chumshe Torah, and it's similar a little bit, at least for this discussion, to halachos. So that's why you're allowed to only because of, as the Gemara said, Eis Lasos Lashem, we're going to make an exception. Because again, as Rashi explained, if the shul did not have, right, the Haftorah, then they said we'd rather at least lane from a single Haftorah, which is not great, but it's still okay b'di'eved, rather than forget the whole concept of Haftorah. That's why today, I don't know how many people are mocked, but if you notice, it's always best to lane the Haftorah not from a Chumash, because it's the Haftorah and the Chumash is usually after each of the Parshios. So what they do is most shuls have a big Tanakh or a Haftorah book, and the whole Nach is in there, and then you turn to your selection for that week. That's what most people prefer to do. But either way, we see that this is something to be taken seriously. So what is the source of all this? So the source of all this, as we said a minute ago, was a pasuk in Kitisa. What does the pasuk say? Let's look at this pasuk. The pasuk says, let me find it. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ksov lecha es hadvarim ha'ela, ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela karati itcha bris ve'es Yisrael. God said to Moshe, write down these dvarim, these commandments. Okay, why? Because through these commandments, I will make a bris with the Jewish people. Sounds like a very simple pasuk, right? And the Gemara is bothered with the fact that the verb is ksov lecha, write down. Then it says ki al pi. Okay, so as an introduction, let us look at the Rabbeinu Bechaya on this pasuk. The Rabbeinu Bechaya, first of all, he brings down a medrash. Okay, the Rabbeinu Bechaya brings down a medrash. The medrash says the following: Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Shalom bikesh Moshe Rabbeinu lihios af hamishna b'ksav. Moshe, while he was up there for 40 days, wanted to even write down the Mishnah. Okay, he said the Chumash is not enough. I want to write down all the halachas for the Jewish people. Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe echtav lecha rubei torasi aval kamo zar nechshavu. So he quotes, the Medrash quotes, this is actually a pasuk that we see on Daf Samech, which is a pasuk that we're not going to discuss. It happens to be a pasuk that proves that most of the Torah is written, because if you just look for 1 second on Daf Samech Amud Beis 60b on the third line, where the Gemara says that most of the Torah is Torah Shebechsav, and a minority is Torah Shebal Peh, it brings down this pasuk, which basically says that I'm writing most of the Torah down. So that's most of the Torah is Torah Shebechsav. That's why he's writing it down. So the Medrash, though, and there's a Tosafot over here that talks about it. We're not going to discuss it now, but the Medrash says that he wanted to write down more, but it would be considered something zar, something strange, something alien. The kol kach lama mipnei shehamishna misterosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Medrash says because the Mishnah is one of those secrets, right? It's like a sod. It's one of the secrets of God. Ve'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu megalim misutrosav el liyireyav. And we don't want everyone to see this. We don't want everyone to see these hidden secrets. Shenemar sod Hashem lireyav. So that's why Moshe wasn't allowed to write down the Mishnah. It's not for everyone to see. And we're going to see in a second, the Chassam Sofer basically says something beautiful about this. The end of the Rabbeinu Bechaya, if I could pull it up. Yes.
What role do you think the polemic they're having with the Tzedukim has with all this? Because the Tzedukim denied the authority of the Torah.
It's a great question. I thought about that. I don't know how they make heads or tails out of this. It's a very good question. It's a very good question because you're right. They don't consider Torah Shebal Peh at all. So how could Rov, right? If Rov is Torah Shebal Peh, then one question is then what's left, right? There's very nothing left. So I don't know. It's a great question. Let me read the Rabbeinu Bechaya, because what he does is Rabbeinu Bechaya in his Perush on this pasuk gives us a little bit of a summary of what's going on. Rabbeinu HaKadosh Shachibar HaMishnah, he says, Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, he actually assembled the Mishnah. Now, again, another topic, not for now. It's not so simple historically what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi did. Everybody is taught in high school that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote the Mishnah. Okay, there are several references throughout Shas. The Maratz Chayes brings down in a couple of places that it's not so clear whether he wrote it or whether he assembled it, because there were proofs that some parts of the Mishnah existed before Rebbe. Okay, again, I'm throwing it out there, so just so you should know that it's actually an interesting topic, but not for now. Whether or not he wrote it or whether he just pieced it together from various places. Anyway, so Rabbeinu Kodesh Chibar HaMishnah v'limer osam b'rabim v'katzfu hakol b'yamav kavanato hayta kadesh lo tishkach Torah miYisrael. The point of Rebbe writing on the Mishnah was so that the Torah would not be forgotten. Shera harisha mispashetes ba'olam. He saw that there was wickedness that was emanating throughout the world. The Yisrael mispazrin begalos, and the Jews are exiling, right? They're leaving Israel, and he saw bad things are coming. He saw that he has he has an injunction, he has a certain ruling that he is allowed to use by imploring this Eis Lasos Lashem pasuk. The Kasav V'Chibar HaMishnah Shehi Torah Shebal Peh, he called it the Mishnah, which is Torah Shebal Peh. V'Alken Kara Mishnah Lefi Shehi Shniya LeTorah. Interesting. Where does the word Mishnah come from? Right? We learn Mishnah all our lives. You know where the word Mishnah comes from? So the accepted version is that lishnot means to learn, right? He says it comes from the word shniya, because Mishnah is second to the Torah. Shmuel, I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but this is why the Rabbeinu
The
Bachai
word
says
Mishnah means second, Mishnah Lamelech.
right, Mishnah Lamelech or Shniya. He says because it's second
Mishnah
to the
Torah. Mishnah
right.
Torah.
Well, that means repeated. Mishnah Torah means to repeat.
No, but it means two, like Deutero, second telling.
Deutero, right. Okay. And 99.9% of the Mishnah, we could talk about the few exceptions some other time, is all Hebrew. And then the generations weakened, and the Amdu Ravina Ravina and Ravashi came along, the Chibru HaTalmud. They assembled this Talmud that we're learning here. Shehu Pirish HaMishnah. Talmud is an explanation of the Mishnah. Kilarov Chachmos Rabbeinu HaKodesh v'Chachmos B'nei Dor Haya Pirish HaTorah Etzlam Muburaru Pashut Mitoch HaMishnah Betzal Dor Rabbeinu Ravashi Haya Amuk V'Sata Ma'od. They were in a very deep generation. Mizeh Amru B'Talmud Al Mishnah Chesurei Mechser V'Hachiktani. Now he actually says something very interesting, that sometimes we see the Gemara amending the Mishnah, right? If there's a kasha or if there's something unclear, the Gemara says, well, you're not understanding the Mishnah correct. There's something missing. So once in a while you should ask, what do you mean there's something missing? If there's something missing, then why don't we just correct the Mishnah? What kind of answer does the Gemara give that there's something missing in the Mishnah? So the Rabbeinu L'chai says something very interesting. He says, not that there's something literally missing in the Mishnah, there's something wrong not with the Mishnah, there's something wrong with our brain. That's what Chisur Mechser, this is a real great Chiddush, right? For all those times you learn Gemara and you're wondering, what kind of excuse of an answer is this Chisur Mechser V'Achiktani? It means that what? That we're missing, we're chaser. Because we can't understand what they knew in the times of the Mishnah. So for us plebeians, it looks like there's something not right. But if you could just understand what it really means, if we lived 1800 years ago when the Mishnah was assembled, then we would understand. That's beautiful. What do you think about that, Shmuel? You ever hear that?
I never heard that.
Unbelievable.
Never.
Now, I actually heard there's a second reason what Chesura Mechsera means, because there is an obscure Tosfos Yontif, I believe, in Midos that says that the way they used to learn the Mishnah, they used to sing it, okay, like by heart. Like if you ever been to like a cheder, or like a ultra Orthodox day school or school, the way they learn psukim is not the way we learn psukim today in our modern yeshiva. They actually sing it, right? They have a tune to it, and when you learn something with a tune, it's like a song. It has a beat, and that's the way you memorize things, right? People memorize things different ways, like the way you remember presidents or states or whatever it is, right? You have a song to it. So they used to have a song to the Mishnah, and it's either the Tosfos Yontif or it's, I don't know, maybe the Yachin Boaz. I don't know. One of the Perushim says that that's why the Mishnah had to be worded a certain way for the kids, for the Talmidim, to study it by heart. That's why if it doesn't necessarily jive, it all has to be written out in a certain way, just for them to memorize it better. So there you go. If for nothing else tonight, we learned two reasons why the Gemara sometimes says Chesuri Mechsera V'Hachiktani. Okay.
And I studied this with Professor Elman at Yeshiva University. He said, well, why don't they just change the Mishnah? He said, no, because once you committed to memorizing it orally, you can't change it.
Right. Okay. So that's a similar. Okay. Excellent. Very good.
Bezalel,
Yeah.
can I ask a question?
Sure.
So are you saying the Mishnah, as it was written in Lashon Kodesh, because it was, a writing down of the oral law. So was it a compilation, or was it was the writing down as it was given at Har Sinai?
Great question. Well, your first question about why it's in Hebrew. So I think Rabbeinu Bechaya explained it. Not only is it in Hebrew, it's in very simple Hebrew, right? He uses the word, let me just look back. He said the word tzach, like very smooth, like easy on the tongue. So that way, right? He said here, he said, "V'ruba lashon hakodesh tzach ketorah shebechtav." It's like Hebrew from the Chumash, right? The Hebrew from the Chumash isn't really complicated. It's simple Hebrew. So he wanted to use the same lashon of the Torah. Here they explain that most of it is clear and unmistakable Hebrew. That's why they picked. That's why he picked Hebrew and not Aramaic or anything else to make it easy. The second part of your question is complicated. We don't have time to talk about it exactly where it came from, but let's see. Okay, so getting back to this, so I mentioned before.
You don't have to answer the complicated part, but if there are arguments in the Mishnah.
Correct.
Well, so is that
yes,
argument
that's also
about?
So yes, we believe that is Misinai also. Everything is Misinai. It's right, just like we saw that that Moshe saw Rabbi Akiva, right, in a time warp, darshaning thing. So again, it's very hard for us to understand this concept, but we believe, or at least we're led to believe by all these interpretations, that what Moshe really got in Sinai were all of these halachas also that are controversial.
Okay.
That he saw, or he foresaw, that there was going to be a machlokas. He knows that Rabbi Shmuel says X and Rabbi Akiva says Y, and Abaye says X and Rava says Y. So all of this was determined somehow.
Okay.
As opposed to halacha l'Moshe Messinai's, which again is a whole separate topic, but halacha l'Moshe Messinai's were undeniable. They weren't debated at all, and that was also given that. Well, hence the term halacha l'Moshe Messinai. So getting back to this, so I wanted to read the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer says, if you look at the Gemara says, it says, Ki al pi advarim ha'eleh, it says, V'tzarech iyun ha'mishmas ha'pasuk hu behepech. The pasuk, though, when you read it, though, it should be the opposite, because the harei matchil ksov l'cha advarim, right? What does the pasuk say? Write down ksov l'cha advarim ha'eleh, which alludes to Torah shebichsav, Ki al pi advarim ha'eleh karati t'chabrit. The Imken, he says, Mashma decreases bris kayal ksav l'cha v'lo al Torah shebal peh. The Gemara says that we didn't see it exactly, but the Gemara says that the whole bris of the Torah was for Torah shebal peh. But the beginning of the pasuk says ksav l'cha zvrimel. It says you should write this. So therefore, the bris should be going on the Torah shebechsav and not on the Torah shebal peh. So he brings down this pasuk in Hosea that Rabbeinu Bechaya brought in the Medrash also, Echtov Lachem Rubi Torasi, right? That most of my Torah I'm going to write Kamozar Nechshavu. So what does this pasuk mean? We just said it quickly. And the Tosfos over here also discusses it on the top of Samach Hamid Beis, the very first Tosfos. He said, the Chassam Sofer says, Sha'amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Im echtov lachem gam Torah shebal peh. And this is a very fine point that we know, but we never thought of this. And that's why these Chassam Sofers that we bring all the time, they're very deep and they're points that we should all realize, but we skip over it. Let's think about it for a second. If hypothetically we were to write down all the Torah Shebal Peh at Sinai, Yatiku Osa of the Avodah Zarah, the rest of the world, Umasa Olam, the rest of the world, what are they going to do? They're going to have their own art scroll and their own Steinsaltz, their own version. Why? Because let's think about it for a second. We have our Old Testament in Hebrew. What else is there? Well, there's the King James. So in the King James, I didn't read it from front to back, but a lot of it I did read. It's an interpretation of, it's like a Sansino. It translates the psukim exactly the way they are. It doesn't bring in Onkelos, it doesn't bring in Rashi, it brings in exactly the psukim in English. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. That's how the King James Bible starts. So you may ask, so what's so special about the Chumash? Meaning, if someone who didn't know anything picked up the Bible and said, okay, there's a Hebrew version and there's an English version, they may not even know which one came first, right? So there's nothing special, kaviyachol, about a Torah shebechsav, right? It could be translated into any language, right? So therefore, and he says, Im ken b'amen nivdalnu min ha'amim, im lehem gam ken yitgalu chukav v'mishpatav. If they have their own shas and their own rishonim all translated, then how are we special? How are we different? But it's like today, right? There's a whole okay, we won't talk about that. Right? We need to be special, right? He brings on the pasuk that Goyim can't learn Torah Shebal Peh, right? So that's why when we wrote down a Torah Shebechsav, ve'ein hefsed lanu b'hatakdam, noten reshus lichtov avol yoser. So the only thing we want to give the Goyim, we want to give the rest of the world to copy is our Torah Shebechsav. We don't want them to copy our Torah Shebal Peh. That's the pasuk of Ksav L'cha es hadvarim ha'ele. So when it says that you should write these things, dvarim ha'ele ata kosev, you could only write these things, the 5 books of Moses, and that's it. V'yata kosev Torah Shebal Peh. You can't write it because ki lo ichbas kulei hai ba'atakan. We don't care if they copy our Torah Shebechsav. Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ele. You know what the P is? The P is the Torah Shebechsav is the only thing that we care about because that's what the bris is, something that we don't want to give the non-Jew something tangible in book form that they could translate into their own language. I think that's a really beautiful Chassam Sofer and what the difference is between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Now, okay, so we explained.
Holly, can I ask a question?
Sure, no
Little
problem.
question. You probably all know this, but I'm new to this. What's the idea about someone who can't read? Let's say a blind person, a legally blind person. How do they read the Torah? Is there a Braille Torah? Is it in any other language? Or a hearing impaired person? How do they do Torah Bal Peh, Shebal Peh?
Good question. Well, we have a rabbi in our audience, Shmuel. Shmuel, you silent?
He's mute.
Oh, no. So
He was a rabbi
the
for
question
19
is-
years of a congregation.
Yeah, and we did have a blind, there was a blind member and she read from a Braille text for Bat Mitzvah, but I'm not really sure I understand your question. Are you asking, can you get an aliyah if you're blind?
Can
So
you lane? Can you lane?
So that's machokas, and my father could tell you about his grandfather who knew how to read the Torah, but when he became blind, he stopped reading the Torah. But I believe we paskin that you can get an aliyah when you're blind, but it depends. And when it comes to laning, it depends if you're blind from birth or if you became blind afterwards. But I'm just talking from memory. Today's daf said that you're not supposed to paskin from memory. You're supposed to look at the bar and they debate it. Okay, it's an excellent question, but it's a question that's discussed.
So is there such a thing as a Braille Torah, a Braille Sefer?
No.
No.
In terms of a kosher Torah scroll, well, 1 second. In terms of a kosher Torah scroll, there's very specific halachos, and halachos of a Torah scroll. You can't have a kosher Torah scroll in a different language. But about a Megillah Esther, that could be written theoretically, perhaps in a different language. But the question is, could it be written in Braille? I never seen a psak that said it can, but that would be a question about Megillah Esther, but not about a Sefer Torah.
Thank
So
you.
Great. So everything so we understand this concept of Torah Shabbat can't be written. How about asking the question why? Why? What is the reason? So there's a very interesting Maharal, Gur Aryeh, who writes in his parish on Rashi, where this pasuk is in Kitisa. He says, well, Kvar Nasnu Tam, look in the Gemara in Eruvin. So he says, if you knew Eruvin, you'd know the reason, on Daf Chaf Aleph, you would know the reason why you can't write down Torah Sheba'al Peh. And he quotes, Lama lo huta lichtov Torah Sheba'al Peh. You know why you can't write Torah Sheba'al Peh? Mipnei she'ein ketz v'sof l'Torah Sheba'al Peh. He says, because it's boundless. It has no end. So how do you write something that can never end? Right? A book has an ending. There may be bad endings, but everything that we read, the Chumash has an ending, right? Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra, Moshe dies in Zos HaBracha, it ends. Yehoshua, Shoftim, it all ends. Torah Sheba'al Peh is a bottomless pit. It never, never, never ends. And he quotes a Gemara we're going to see in a second. He says, V'lo kasva haTorah el adavar sheshayach elav ksiva. So you could only deal with something that has ksiva, that's writable. The chol davar shenichtav hu mishuar umugbal. Anything that can be written has a finite, right? It's finite and it has boundaries. It has a beginning and it has an end. V'zeh ma shenichtav. V'darsha ba'atzmo she'en lo ketz v'sof, but something that has no time limits and you could do it forever. It can never ever end. That is the reason, because it doesn't end. And he ends off by saying, says the Maharal, he says anything else, any other reason that you'll see for this has no merit. So what's this Gemara in Eruvin that he brings down? So the Gemara in Eruvin, a very interesting daf Chaf Aleph, talks about the following discussion. Let me open up the Gemara. The Gemara says, Dorosh Rava. Rava says, he brings down the pasuk in Koheles. So Rava brings down the pasuk in Koheles all the way at the end. It's the last chapter of Koheles, right before the last pasuk. He quotes the pasuk that says, he says, be careful, my son, be careful of making many books, right? Because there's no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh, right? Bini, hizahir b'divrei sofim yoter midivrei Torah. Paulus is warning us, be careful, be more concerned about mitzvos d'Rabbanan than mitzvos d'Oraisa. Shedivrei Torah yesh behen aseh v'lo taseh. Because when it comes to words of the Torah, when it comes to negative, when it comes to commandments in the Torah, there's an aseh and there's a lo taseh. The divrei sofrim kol ha'over divrei sofrim chayav misa. When it comes to rabbinic, as literally, of course, but that's what he says. Don't underestimate basically this concept of things that are d'Rabbanan. Now, Shema Tomar. So the Gemara says, maybe you're going to say, Im yesh behen mamish, mipnei malo nechtav. If they are so important, right, then why aren't they written? Mipnei malo nechtavu, why weren't they written? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Asot farim harbe ein ketz. That's why the pasuk at the end in Koheles says, of making all of these sfarim, there's no end. Meaning it's impossible to write the whole Torah Sheba'al Peh down because it's endless, right? How do you write something that is endless? So there's your one answer about why we can't write it down. I saw the Rav Yaakov Emden on that Gemara says something very interesting. He quotes our Gemara that we had in Tamura, and right before that in Tamura, the Gemara says on Daf, actually it's on Daf Tezayin, Rav Yaakov Emden says, you know why you can't write it down? She'im natnu bavas achas misina, because if everything was given in Har Sinai, Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh, what would have happened? Hayu mishtachan d'mei avlo shel Moshe. There's a Gemara in Tamura, this is the Gemara similar to what we saw before, that says that at the end, when Moshe died, during his time, when they were mourning for him, right? It says that they mourned for him. The Gemara actually says that many halachas were forgotten during those times. So he says that if everything would have been given, then he says everything would have also been forgotten. So that's why Torah Shebal Peh was not given. I thought that was a very cute, interesting line that Rav Yaakov Emden writes. So we see reasons why it can't be written. Now, I want to spend the rest of the time on this concept that we had on the Samach Amar Aleph, where we saw this pasuk of Eis La'asos LaHashem. All right, so first of all, where does this pasuk come from? So this is actually a pasuk from Tehillim, right? It's in probably the most famous chapter in Tehillim, chapter 119, right? The longest chapter in Tehillim, that says, it's in the ayins, obviously, right? The Kapitel 119 has 176 psukim, right? It goes in alphabetical order. So the pasuk says in pasuk 126, it literally means it is a time to act to God. Eis la'asos l'Hashem. It's a time to act for God. Heferu Torasecha, because they have violated your Torah, your teaching. Okay, I want to just read the simple interpretation, the way the Radak reads this pasuk. He says, Eis is a time, or we know another word for the word time is umoed laHashem. There's a time for God, sheyaseh nikama, that God will take revenge, kasher haferu torasecha, when the Torah was violated. Afal pisha bizman hazeh tamarich l'rashoim, even though we know God is very, very, very patient when it comes to punishing the wicked people, yavo eis shetifara mehem, they will have their day, right, when they will be acted upon and they will have, right, when they will be judged. V'hu eis ha'geula, and that is the redemption, k'mo shekasav b'nevuas malachi. So that is one way he explains it. But that is really the simple explanation of what this pasuk means, right? It's interesting that the Rabbeinu Yonah in Pirkei Avos says the following. We know that, let me just pull up Pirkei Avos, chapter 5 in Pirkei Avos, Mishnah 2 says the following. Asora Doros me'Adam va'ad Noach. Right? We know that there were 10 generations from Adam until Noach. Lahodia kama erech apayim lefanav. Right? To show how much patience God had, right? To punish, things were bad, not just at the end, things were bad pretty much from the beginning. But shekol hadoros hayu machisin, it got worse and worse and worse, says the Mishnah, ad shehevi alehem ezmei hamabu. Until at the end, that was it. God waited 10 generations until he brought the Mabul. Asara doros menoach that Abraham, lahodia kama erech apayim lefanav, to show how much patience God had. Shekol hadoros hayu machisin ubain, it was continuously bad, even after the flood. It got worse and worse and worse until ad sheba Abraham, until Abraham came and not got punishment, right? So you would think that the Mishnah would say, just like by Noach, right, there was punishment, right? No. Abraham came, the kibel alav schar kula. The Mishnah ends off by saying that Abraham came and took the schar of all the previous 9 generations. So there's a beautiful Rabbeinu Yonah, he explains the following. He says, everybody has their portion both in Gan Eden and in Gehenna. If he's good, he goes up. If he's bad, he goes down. We know that. But the fact that everybody is commanded to do good, and this person doesn't do good, so the one good person around is doing good for everyone. So therefore, his reward is midas adino tenis shito chaka b'chelak chaveru b'gan eden. So he gets not only his portion, he gets everyone else's portion. That's why the Mishnah ends off by saying, as opposed to Noach, who was good, but he wasn't the best, right? We say that he was a tzaddik, but he wasn't the ultimate. So Noach didn't get the schar of everyone. The Mishnah just said that God punished everyone. And Noach survived, though, but he didn't get everyone. Abraham was on a higher level. Abraham Avinu collected not only his schar, but the schar of everybody else. V'zehu shenemar, now he's talking to us. Eis lasos laHashem hefer torasecha. What does that mean? Imra'ita dorsha misrashel min haTorah asukba. He says that if you see a generation that is lax in Torah study, you go out of your way and delve into Torah. Upashte dekra eis lasos bishvil Hashem, right? Because of God. Hefer torasecha achar shekulam nefir in Talmud Torah. Because everybody else is rejecting Torah, Yoter yesh li lasot b'shvil Hashem misha'ara doros shachas v'shal motich kachena Torah miYisrael. So those two, you have to go. If you see them, the generation going one way, the bad way, you have to double up and go exactly the other way. Okay, so that's the way the Rabbeinu Yonah explains this pasuk based on the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. So he actually has this concept. So this concept that Rabbeinu Yonah takes is actually from the Gemara in Brachos Samach Gimel, because the real first source where the Gemara or the Mishnah uses Eis lasos laHashem hefer torasecha is from a Mishnah all the way at the end of Maseches Brachos. The very last Mishnah in Maseches Brachos is a very interesting Mishnah. It starts off by saying, Kishem shem mevarach al tova, kach mevarach al hara, right? We all know that statement, that you have to say Baruch Dayan Emes, just like you say a bracha on a positive thing, you say bracha on a negative thing. And the Mishnah goes a little bit off track and ends off by saying that hiskinu, right? It talks about that the way they would end off the bracha in the Beis Hamikdash, they would say min ha'olam v'ad ha'olam, and the tzedukim would say, well, there's only one olam, so that's why we had to say min ha'olam v'ad ha'olam. And the Mishnah says v'hiskinu shia adam shoel shlom chaver b'shem, right? The Mishnah says that there was a takana that people would greet people with the name of God. Now, I find this very interesting because this was actually yesterday's daf. If you remember, daf Samach Beis, the way the fifth parak ended, right? Because the last takana of all these takanas all these tikkun olams that we've had for the last month and a half, the very, very last one, remember what it is? It's that you're allowed to say hello to an anju. You could be Shoel Shalom, because God's name is Shalom. That concept also is from this Mishnah that has to do with Eis lasos laHashem. I found that a very interesting connection. But anyways, so the Mishnah says that you would say Shalom to a friend. That's how you would greet them. Shenemar, he brings a pasuk that Boaz would greet the Kotzrim. He would say Hashem imachem. And then at the end, the Mishnah says, V'omer Eis lasos laHashem hefer torasecha, Rab Nasan omer hefer torasecha mishum Eis lasos laHashem. What is going on over here? Why does the Mishnah digress? So Rashi explains on this Mishnah on Daf Nun Daled in Brachos that you are actually allowed to say Shalom to a person. So why shouldn't you? Because Rashi says V'lo amrinan mezalzel hu b'chvodo shel hamakom b'chvil kvod habrios lahotzi shem shemayim alav. Because the word Shalom is a name of God. So I would have thought it's a disgrace for God for you to use God's name to someone else to say hello to them. So therefore, the Mishnah says no. To honor someone, to honor your fellow friends, we're allowed to do that to show you how important it is to interact with people. And we learned it out from Boaz. And the reason why we're allowed to do this is because Eis Lasos LaHashem, right? Which means, as Rashi says, Pa'amim Mizbatlin Divrei Torah Kedei Lasos LaHashem. Sometimes we negate the proper edict from the Torah in order to do something special. Because God really wants us to greet our friends. How do you know? The pasuk says, "Bikei shalom v'radfehu," right? We say that in Yosher B'Seser, I think, at the end, right? Bikei shalom v'radfehu, right? Mutter lahafer Torah lasas devar hanira aser. You're allowed to do away with Torah temporarily in order to do something that appears to be aser. Okay, so that is what the Mishnah in, right? That's what the Mishnah says. And like I said before, that actually connects to our Gemara in Gittin about the last takana. Now, the Gemara on Daf Samach Gimel says, this pasuk is very interesting because Amar Rava, I'm reading from Bracha Samach Gimel Amar Aleph. If you have a brachas in front of you, 63a, the second to last blot in the Seches Brachos. About 20 lines from the top, it says, this pasuk can be read two ways. Haikra Meresha L'Seifa, Midrasha, Hai pasuk Meresha L'Seifa Midrash, Miseifa L'Resha Midrash. You could read this pasuk front to back or back to front. What does that mean? Meresha L'Seifa Midrash, if you read it the way we have it, Eis Lasos LaHashem, there's a time to do for Hashem, which basically means that there's a time for God to do his mishpat, to do his judgments for those people who violate, right? Why? My time, God will have you will have your time in judgment eventually because you violated the Torah. But as we hinted before, God will wait. He's very, very patient when it comes to strict judgment. So that's what the first way this pasuk means, that there's a time that God will judge because you were made for the Torah. But here's the punchline. Miseifa l'Resha Midrash. You could take this same pasuk and flip it and say, Hefera Torah Secha, right? You can be made for the Torah. You could change the Torah. Okay, you could go against the Torah. My taima, mishum eis lasos laHashem, because there are special occasions that call for it. And that's what we've been saying up to now. There are special occasions like we discussed in the beginning. What are some of the special occasions? When they thought that we were going to forget it. If we're going to forget Torah Shabbal Peh, then, well, of course, what would you rather have? If you're not going to do Haftorah anymore, because we're worried about you having a Navi, a one-chapter Navi and a scroll, we're going to do it. We're going to break these laws that seem a little bit unreasonable, right, for the sake of continuing, right, this nation from surviving, right? We want to continue learning and understanding and having this Masorah. So we're not going to break it and forget things just because we can't write it down. So just to end, that all of this, what we've been saying is history. So the question is there any carryover of this concept today? Right? Let's talk practical, right? We know that one of the big discussions is, does Judaism, how do we adapt to the 21st century? Why are we so stuck on and hell-bent on all these ancient things? And do we ever have a right or a moment where we could change things, right, for the betterment of society because of Eis Lasos LaHashem? So I happen to see in the Tshuvas of, it's called Beinei Banim, which is Rav Yehuda Henkin. Sorry about that. Rav Yehuda Henkin wrote, this is from Tafshin Nun Beis. This is about 30 years ago. Okay, the topic, okay, which I guess we'll spend the next 5 minutes on reading, is, believe it or not, the topic of women learning Torah. So I've managed to evade this topic for 2 years since doing this. But I thought it would be interesting because we have, half the audience are women, it appears. So he uses this. He was asked a question. I'm gonna read some of it. B'davar heter l'nashim lilmod Torah. The question is, can women learn Torah? Sheri'itam la'echad migdolei zmano, because he quotes the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is famous for saying that women should be learning items, preparing things that we're going to need in the Beis HaMikdash, Kudshim and Taharos. That's what the Lubavitcher Rebbe said. Rav Soloveitchik recommended them learning Moed, Hilchas Shabbos, Eruvin, things that pertain today. Unfortunately, Rav Moshe Feinstein was not so into this. As we know, he was not into, teaching Talmud to most women as it was, for men. So he quotes over here. I'm just going to read a little bit about it. He says, the reason of people not wanting to do this, or the reason why people are adapting, Mishum Brachos, right? He quotes the Mishnah, Mereisha L'Seifa, okay, sometimes you have to go against the Torah, which sounds antithetical, but sometimes you go against the Torah in order to fulfill it. So he says, well, let's look at historically. If you go back to the Gemara, and we spent a nice hour on this, discussing that there are things that are mentioned in the Mishnah and the Gemara, such as She'ela Shalom, right? Which is not really a terrible isser. It looks like you're being the Zalzel, you're disgracing the name of God, but we're allowed to do it because of Eis Lasos Hashem. That's one example. He brings down the Gemara in Yuma, which we didn't talk about, where the story where Shimon HaTzadik wore the big day kahuna outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, that was a special occasion. And then you're allowed to write the Haftorahs. He quotes our Gemara in Gittin. You're allowed to write the Haftorah, even though you can't really write down Dvarim, right? Right? You can't write down half of a book. Nevertheless, because Eis Lasos, and then he brings down about writing Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Gemara in Tamura, also the Gemara in Gittin, that you're allowed to do. Okay, that's fine. So he says, Ach ein mikol eila raya l'inyanenu. That's not really so much of a proof to our topic. Kishani b'mei haGemara shehaya lehem koach l'taken. He says, unfortunately, we don't have the power to change things around. We just can't go to our local rabbi and say, this isn't kosher, but, this is what they're serving. Or I can't get this, I'm going away. Could you bend the rules? We try really, really not to bend the rules. So he's saying over here that sometimes you can, but for the most part, these Rabbanim cannot. Problem is, you can't compare, well, you're allowed to say Hashem's name, so therefore we could do something today, right? You could say Shalom. That's not the way it works. Today, we find every single excuse to say, we have to adapt to society, right? Right? He says that, so now he's talking about teaching Torah to girls. He says, we're trying to find excuses. Therefore, we have some achronim who says you could teach Tanakh to girls, and Musar, and Dinim, and laws. Okay, so he says, look over there. He says the problem is there's no unanimity in this. Because one community could be okay with this, right? That's fine, but but it won't fly in the next community. So he goes to this whole thing, and he's basically saying, is this an occasion of Eis Lasos Hashem Mefer Torasecha, right? And I just want to skip all the way to the end, right? Because we only have a few minutes left, but I just want to read all the way at the end. He says, there's a difference between teaching women Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebechsav. Ki nashim somchos ala Torah Shebechsav, because women, right, accept what's in Torah Shebechsav, but they may not accept Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is ironic because tonight's here is Torah Sheba'al Peh and we have women in attendance. But anyways, so I just want to say that he goes at length, and the end of the day, he's pro. So just to make you all happy that we're not doing anything wrong over here, he says, and I'll quote him, he says, I'll read it in English. Women who are highly educated in secular subjects, but lacking in Torah, contrast the shallowness of their Jewish knowledge with the depth and interest they find in other fields. In the opposite of the situation, described by the Rambam, the poverty of their Torah education leads them to imagine that the Torah is trivial. Eis Lasos Lashem today calls for the expansion and deepening of women's Torah studies, and there are halachic grounds for doing so, as I have shown. To prevent all women from learning Talmud, as in earlier generations, is an example of foolish piety and causes souls to be lost, God forbid. But even without this consideration, to the extent that they are exceptions to what was once the majority, it is permitted to teach women Talmud. So there you go. So we wanted to know today, give me an example of Eis Lasos Lashem. So we see a tshuva written by Rabbi Yehuda Henkin about 31 years ago that says that this, in his opinion, is a reason why we could teach Talmud to women today. So,
Bravo.
okay. You're all invited back next week. It's a good thing he said that at the end.
Very good.